I'm Lorna. I work on developer experience at a company called Redocly. We make open API tooling, including Redoc, an API documentation tool that you might have seen. Today I want to talk to you about better APIs and crucially about how to make those API improvements something that become part of the way that you work rather than something that you do once and then it sort of decays or rots over time. I call it repeatably better APIs. Let's start with, what does better mean for an API? For me, it means that your API is pretty clear. It's easy to see what the different parts of it will do or how to achieve a task that it is supposed to let you achieve. Your API needs to be consistent, and this is super difficult. Modern APIs can be big and complicated, and sometimes there are lots of them as well, and they may be published as a single API. That consistency piece is something that we need to aim for and work on, and I have some tips for you. I think other key parts here are also about how well organized your API is, and a good symptom of how good something is in terms of how well structured it is what does the documentation look like? If the documentation for an API, well, if it doesn't exist, that tells you everything you need to know about this API, and you should try a competitor immediately. If the documentation exists and is well organized, probably the API behind it is also pretty well organized, pretty well laid out, and is going to be nice and reliable, comfortable to use. If your API isn't well organized, the docs almost certainly are not, and any SDKs or other artifacts that you output from your API description are definitely not going to be. So it's a really good tell. The other thing the documentation can tell you about an API is just how much the API provider cared about the developer experience of the people who have to use it. And I find this varies enormously, particularly on APIs where the people who make the decision about which API to use, or it just comes with something, and not the people who have to actually integrate against it. So if you have really useful descriptions with links to extra documentation or examples in the documentation of what format this parameter should be or how the different responses should look, those are all things that will give you the idea that this API is better. All of this benefits the producer of the API as much as it does the consumer. Being clear about what you're outputting often really helps the development process if you're publishing APIs. Another big thing is that whether you want to say microservices in public as a buzzword or not, we all work on more complex software applications today. A lot of them are made of components that are connected by APIs. The really great API practice helps us and helps our consumer, helps us as producers and helps all our consumers to use our API. And those consumers might not be third-party paying customers. They might be your colleagues. And I don't know about you, it's important to love customers. I love my colleagues at least as much. And good practice here is going to help us all to get our jobs done. So it's really important to get things as good as they can be. And best means different things in different organizations. I am not going to give my API guidelines talk right now, but thinking about what's appropriate in your situation and how what I'm going to show you would translate to what you do, I think is a really important part of who we are as software developers, as API specialists, in terms of understanding what's out there, but then understanding which things make sense for our particular scenario or for our particular audience. So I feel like I've talked enough. So let's have a look at some really specific examples. I have a really small example toy open API description that we could use to look at. I work for Redocly, so it's all Redocly tools today. I know them the best. All of these have competitor tools. If you are already using other tools, find out how to do these things in those tools before you immediately, I mean, you can switch to Redocly if you like. Obviously, I am delighted, but that's not the point of this. This is just, I know these tools better. I'm also a Vim user, so you'll get to see that too. Fun for everyone. So most of what I'm showing you today is Redocly CLI. It's a JavaScript package, install it with npm. And let's have a look. So if I put my screen on so you can see it, this is a very simple restaurant API. You can see we've got an info block, we've got some tags associated here, and the paths are pretty simple. So I have some users paths and then some endpoints that relate to the actual restaurants themselves. And we can have a little look around at this. If I get over here, you can see we've got both get and post, so we can register some users. The endpoints are tagged. We've got some responses here. So this is pretty standard. There's nothing really special. I actually really like common features of OpenAPI. It has a bunch of edge stuff, but I find I don't need it a lot of the time. Next, let's have a look at the tool we'll be using, which is Redocly. Oh, I can't even spell it. That's a great start. Redocly. It does a bunch of things. We can have a look at that stats command. You can split your big OpenAPI description files and use them in many smaller chunks. I find this useful, especially with editors that don't love editing hundreds of thousands of lines of YAML or JSON. What else have we got? We've got the join command to help you if you have multiple APIs that actually get published on a common gateway. It can be useful to create a single API description. We're going to look a lot at linting today because linting is how we validate and ensure quality and certain other criteria about our API. So we're going to be big on lint today. You can also use bundle. Bundle takes your API and you can resolve the references if you want. If you're using it split, bundle puts it back into one file. Some other tools prefer it like that. So you can work on it in a way that's easy for you in development, and then, if necessary, bundle as the input to the next tool down the line. Yeah, so you'll see bundle because I have a transform step that I want to show you. And then we've got preview docs and build docs and the completion file, which lets you do autocomplete. Cool. So let's stop looking at the help. This is the stats file, so you get a sense of what that API description is that I just showed you. You can see it's got 5 references, 3 path items, 5 operations in total, some external documents, some schemas, some parameters, and 2 tags. I like the stats command, especially when I'm seeing an OpenAPI description for the first time. It gives me a sense of how big it is. And I've seen some fun implementations that like track this over time to look like how much is our API growing and should it be growing like that or not. Next we're going to do, let's have a look at some linting. So straight out of the box, we've got a lint command, and the lint is going to check for a bunch of certain standards and give us some feedback on this. Now straight away it tells me I didn't provide any configuration. So it does use the recommended rule set from Redocly, which is pretty opinionated. Obviously, I agree with it because my OpenAPI example checks out as valid. But we can also dial that down a little bit. Let's create that config file because there'll be a bunch of things that you can do here. So I will need it. Oh, I have this open somewhere. Oh, that's probably not good. Okay, let's see. I'm going to stop using the recommended one and just reduce it to be using the minimal standard. I really like the recommended standard, but minimal is easier to reason about. All it does is check for that your OpenAPI is valid, a great start. It makes sure that you don't have any trailing slashes on paths because that could choke a lot of other tools. Make sure that all of your $ref entries resolve, and also warns if there are any server variables that are empty, because again that's a common mistake, and we want to check that. Probably no other tools can use your spec if you're missing those things. Okay, so Now, if I lint again, it's still valid, but I don't have the config warning, so we are good to go. One thing that we can do with all of the linting tools is choose whether, if something's not there or not quite right, whether that counts as an error or as a warning. The minimal standard actually has a bunch of things as a warning. I am generally anti-warnings. And the reason is, okay, if it's a warning, you'll see it when you're developing locally, but it won't fail the build. It won't show up on the pull request, CI integration output. It's going to get merged. If you care about it, make it an error, make your pull request fail and your local validation fail. If you don't care about it, doesn't need to be a warning. So having been through a bunch of different iterations on this, just make your warnings into errors, or if they're too annoying, turn them off. I feel like the warnings are like the snake in the grass. They're there, you get warned about them, but we never really fix them in the real world. The one thing I want to do here is make sure that I have some sensible defaults in place. And one thing that I see that's a little bit frustrating about OpenAPI descriptions is that the operation ID is not required. So this users list, it's optional. It doesn't even have to be unique by OpenAPI standard requirements, but I think both of those things are kind of important. So if I start changing things here, I'm gonna confuse myself completely, but we'll just give it a go. If I make the same operation ID twice, and then also remove an operation ID, I am going to regret this, but we'll keep the file open. I can always press undo. Then I'm going to add some files to my redocly.yaml to fix that. Still have it open somewhere else. Okay, let's see. I'm going to add some rules. I'm going to add I'm going to require that the operation ID is there, and I've said my piece about whether that should be a warning or an error. And I'm also going to require that it is unique. So as well as that, I have these are rules, built-in rules, and I'm going to learn to spell and talk at the same time. It's a key skill. And print them like this. Operation ID unique, both of those should produce errors. So let's run our lint command again. Great, so we've got two errors. One is I've got an operation with no operation ID, and the other one is this should be unique. And you can see that these are two different rule responses. Hopefully you can see the blue on the screen share. Operation ID is used, sometimes it's not visible when you're working with visual tools or docs previews, but it is used in a bunch of surprising places. It's used in the anchor fragment, it's used in, it often shows up in like generated SDKs as a function name or things like that. So choosing an operation ID that uniquely identifies this endpoint in a way that you would understand it, even in a forest of API endpoints, is really important. And that's why I like to have these rules enabled. So in my, if I undo some of this damage, if I put the operation ID back in, we should see we've only got one error now, and it's because there's a duplicate and it shows you where the two entries are. And again, I can just go back and fix those. Hopefully we are back to valid again. The operation IDs, like I say, they're a hidden developer experience, but making sure that they are present, they are unique, and just ask whoever's on your review council to make sure that they make sense is great. I see too many copy-paste operation IDs, and it means that it loses its value later on. So I really like that. One thing that we can also do is generate an ignore file. So when I had those errors in place with the duplicate IDs, we can do it errors, and when it errors, you can see it from the previous command. Here, we have the option to generate the ignore file. Now, what I like about this is it's easy to start a new API project and get everything perfect for the first endpoint that you build, and that almost never happens. I'm not sure I've ever worked on the beginning of an API project. They are legacy from the moment they are born, and they need to be able to evolve and grow with us. The majority of businesses have APIs. They're doing great work. They're providing business value. They might not meet our modern standards of what a perfect API looks like. That doesn't matter. But you end up in this situation where you can't enable new standards or rule sets because the existing API endpoints don't conform to those. This is where the ignore file comes in, because it means that what we can do is ignore the things we know already exist that are a problem, put the current error failures into an ignore file, but leave those rules enabled for the next, all of our future changes will be subject to those rules, and everything that is there kind of has permission to be there, and you can add to that list if you need to. So this is great when you're retrofitting sort of that quality and compliance and API governance practice to an existing API. So I am going to do that and generate the ignore file. Generate ignore file. Perfect. So it got that problem, it captured it, and it generated it. And it is just that one endpoint. So if we have a look at it, it's called dot something. Oh yeah, look at all my open redocly.yaml files. Anyway, it is this redocly.lintignore.yaml. And all it's saying is this path doesn't have to have a unique operation ID. We have an error there. We're going to give permission for that error to persist. Operation ID is a terrible example. Please fix your operation IDs. But I think the ignore file is an important thing. Okay, what else should we look at? I think there's a bunch of things here that can be really interesting. Not all of them will come with like ready-made rules, and so that's why you can usually describe the rules that you need in the place where you need them. So if I just grab, here's one I made earlier. I'm just going to grab this from the other file. Seems to also be open in another tab because I'm really good at this. Then we can put something more into our redocly.yaml. Probably not that. Come on. This. Right. So what I've pasted here is a configurable rule. I don't have a rule that specifically says that every operation has to have a description, which has to have these rules attached to it, but I can very easily create that using what's called a configurable rule. Some of the other tools call it slightly differently, but it's the similar idea that you can give a rule a name. Mine is called operation description. I hope will help me guess what it's for. You give it a severity. It can be error or warn or off. You've heard my rant, so it's set to error. And we have a subject and an assertion. Now, I typically see this as a really good way to implement those special rules that come with every API. So if it's related to money, it's got a particular prefix or suffix, or this variable has to be named that way, or everybody has these things that help them to be consistent within their existing API. So I have just said, I am an engineer. I love it when people write really great descriptions for the APIs that I have to integrate with. I am going to encourage people to write descriptions with a minimum length. So the subject is of every type operation. I want it to have a description. Now, some of the other toolings will do this by sort of trying to generically address where in the JSON structure the operation description field is. The way the Redocly tools work is, I'm not sure what the technical term would be, but they're type aware. They know that this is an operation object. Whether it appears in a path or a webhook or the components section, like it's an operation, we're going to apply these rules. We check that we have the description property, and under assertions, we say it's defined. So you have to have a description, and its minimum length is 20 characters. So you cannot have a description, which is just like, okay, does thing, right? You get a minimum 20 characters. You can still write a terrible description at greater than 20 characters, but at least this forces you to have something there. And, you know, the quality part really comes from the human review and the work that you do in your API lifecycle process. This is just to make sure that we haven't lost a field or completely forgotten something when we're adding, because as humans, you would review a description if you were reviewing a pull request, but if there's no description field there, you can easily miss it. So we're reviewing that every operation has a description. Spoiler, they don't. And if they fail our checks, then we're going to add an operation description to enrich the developer experience. We're going to encourage people to make the change and say why. So let's see that. If I now lint with that rule in place, yeah, we have 5 errors and 1 problem is explicitly ignored. And that is our duplicate operation ID, which I might remove now because it's sort of disturbing me. Spoiler, there are 5 endpoints. None of these have descriptions. So let's fix some of that. First of all, let's fix our unique operation ID problem. And then if you look at these, you'll see operation ID and summary tags, but no description. Different sets of standards recommend differently whether you need summaries or descriptions. And I think there's not good understanding of what the difference is. So I'll try to summarize. The summary is usually just a few words. It's a really short, I am clearly going to say summary, a short summary of what this endpoint does. And it's shown in, for example, a list of endpoints. You'll often see it in the navigation bar of a docs site, right? The description is shown in the detail. When you're viewing that specific endpoint, then you see the description. The descriptions support Markdown. If I remember, I'll put the link to the article I wrote recently about Markdown in OpenAPI. And so it's Markdown. You can add links or bullet points or emphasis, whatever you need to help the user understand what they should do with this endpoint. So I only have summaries. I do not have descriptions. So let's try and fix this. I feel I could do a better job, but I haven't. So I've added a description to one endpoint. And if I run this again, and I often run my linting in a watch command on the other screen, or I use it in VS Code where it'll just pop up problem views while I'm typing. That's really hard to make it big enough for you to see what I'm doing and that, so we'll just keep running it separately. Now I have 4 errors because I added a description. So I can just be a bit sneaky and add the same description to every endpoint. Summary, add a description, copy and paste. This is like the worst practice ever. Do as I say, not as I do. Okay. And now we should be able to lint, everything's got a description, it meets the criteria, and we get the happy ta-da output. So that's awesome. So these configurable rules cover all the stuff that isn't in the main rules, or pretty much all of it. I find I use these a lot, particularly helping users formalize the stuff they know they need to do. It's often on their review checklist, but you have to sit down and think about how you can implement that yourself. So I quite like that. This is one of my favorites. Other things that I like to put in here for quality of life is things like getting the paths plural in a constant sort of consistent format, those sorts of things. So we have, guess what? We have a rule for that. Kebab case is my preference for paths specifically. It doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent within your API. And again, when you review that someone's added a new endpoint, really easy to miss that it doesn't match the others because you're not looking at the others, you're looking at the diff. So this can just help keep us on the straight and narrow. And also, I love this rule, path segment plural. Let's use plurals. Now, what I already know is we're not compliant with this. I've turned on some rules that I know I now need to go and edit. So I've got 2 failures. Let's fix the one that's visible in the output, which says restaurant site should be plural. All right, okay, fair enough. If I find that, there it is. We'll make that sites. That was 2 errors. Now I have 1 error. It doesn't use kebab case. Right, so I can fix that as well. Put the dash in. Oh, can't type. And how does that look? Awesome. Okay, so that is pretty cool. There's lots of things here that you can do. We've got rules for stopping people from putting verbs in URLs. I've seen a lot as well to stop people putting the digit in a URL. So you can't add a /v2 endpoint. That will fail the validation. I've seen validation to enforce that info.description is in semver format with or without a v, or follows us only has hex characters, or whatever it is. So whatever makes sense for you and for your API, add them to your linting, run this lint all the time when you're working on it, and then put it into your CI/CD as well. There's one more thing that I want to show you, and it's something that I feel is just starting to take shape in the industry, where a lot of the time OpenAPI or API descriptions come from API workflows that are designed first. So this description happens first, we get the design finalized, and then it gets implemented and shipped. So we do a lot of it, it's very shift left. That's not always how it works, especially in the use case where either the API description is generated from code, you've only got in it what was in the code base. This is tricky because it's really hard to add metadata. It's really hard to maintain brilliant and extensive rich content and examples and links and things. Tends to be tricky. There's also scenarios where the API description is fantastic, and then we also want to do some other things to pass it on down our API pipeline, maybe to an SDK generator or some API gateway stuff. The documentation and the documentation tools all have vendor extensions that you can use. So for that, we want to do some sort of transform. The tools are coming together. Redocly has what it calls decorators. So you can take your OpenAPI and you can change it, decorate it. It's not always additive. I'll show you one that's filtery as well. But this can be really important in terms of getting your OpenAPI, making sure it's valid. And then do you need to do some enhancements? Because when you're regenerating or your API is moving quite quickly, you cannot keep making those changes over and over again. So let's have a look at a custom plugin. And what it's going to do is it's going to help us by putting our tags in alphabetical order. We have a rule for checking that the tags are in alphabetical order, and you can turn that on. The machine could fix this for us, and I'm going to show you an example of doing that. Now, Lorna writing JavaScript is not a spectator sport, so I did make this one earlier. What we have here is a custom plugin. Redocly has plugins, so do all the other tools. This is really not a plug, although you get tech support if you use ours, so feel free to do that and ping me if you have questions. So I have a plugin, it's called tag sorting, and one of the things it does, right now the only thing it does, is it sorts the tags alphabetically. So first I'm going to enable that in my redocly.yaml file. The first thing I need to do is, it's a plugin, so I need to let redocly.yaml know that I need it to import the plugins. Now mine is called plugins tag sorting, whoops, like this. So I should be able to import that. And what's inside it is decorators. So just like you can see rules there on line 4, and then I define my rules and my severity, and some of the rules have config, you get like a whole section here. I'm going to define some decorators. You can also do all of this on a per API basis. It's quite tool specific. I'm not going to get into it. Please check the Redocly CLI docs for more on that, or ping me with questions. I've derailed myself. My plugin is called tag sorting, and I want to do the alphabetical. Wow, alphabetical. I'm going to turn that plugin on. You can also pass in any extra config and stuff. This doesn't have any, it just sorts it alphabetically. So I have brought in a custom plugin. It's going to do a decorator step. Now that happens at bundle time, where you bundle an API description. If it's in multiple files, if you've used split, it'll put it into one file. Ours was tiny, so it was in one file, but it can also run these extra processing steps. So, Redocly, bundle, and I'm going to bundle this file that you've seen, which is the restaurants one, and it outputs a bunch of stuff. Now, let me think about how to show this to you the best. Let's just put it in a file. Would be the best. Okay, now they should be the same, but the difference is this is the original file. I have tags, I have user, and I have site. This is not alphabetical order, right? 2 words, one is user, one is site. They need to be the other way around. Now if we look at the after bundling, I've got tags, still got 2 tags, but it's put them in alphabetical order. It's a really small example, but these types of transforms and cleanup and enhancements and adding examples or adding metadata, then I think is really, really important. The other thing you can do with these is not throw things away, is produce OpenAPI descriptions that are a subset of the whole thing. Now this can be super useful if you have endpoints that are still under development, they're only available to partners or internal, things like that. So I'm just going to tag an endpoint to show you this as an example. Let's tag this specific user endpoint. I am going to use a vendor extension called xinternal. I think I just need to set to true. We might have to read the docs on this. Just set to true. And I'm going to enable a decorator that is called remove xinternal. And I'm going to turn that on. So again, it's a decorator. It runs at bundle time. And it looks for any endpoints that have that xinternal vendor property, and it removes them from the output. This is brilliant because it means you can work on a full API description, share that internally, and still, without having to maintain a separate version of it, bundle something that you can then safely publish So this is another of those transform type steps. Redocly uses decorators for this, which I find really helpful. So removing X internal, let's run the bundle step. I'm going to overwrite the file. Yeah, I'm going to overwrite the file, and then we'll just have a look at what we got in it. Great. This is the old file. This one is the new file. And under paths, I've still got the parameters, but I don't have the get entry. So it removes that endpoint, that specific operation, from the output that won't show up when we put things out, which I think is really great. I've shown you a bunch of things here. I think there's a lot that I hope will give you ideas to go and do a load of things I didn't show you. But the point is not really about the tools. I think if we think about not just the technology, but also the idea of making intentional decisions about what we want from our APIs and thinking hard about the human review process, but also the tooling that can help us to ensure the quality. I mean, look, I'm an engineer. I like the tools best as well. I find this stuff totally fascinating. I loved building you a little plugin to demo something new. And I'll share you the link where you can find that if you want to have it and try it, play with it. But I think the important thing here is not the tools, not the vendor, because there are lots of similar alternatives available that you should absolutely evaluate. But it's about our approach to making things better and looking for ways to be efficient in making the right thing happen every time, in making sure that those builds are on the pull request and on all of our repos, and we can run those tools locally. The tools are fun, but they're not the main point of the story. I hope I gave you some tips there for what could be useful in a good API and how to keep it good, not how to do a triage and fix all the things that have gone wrong, but how to make good practice the normal in the APIs that you work with. So I hope it was helpful. Please reach out to me at any time if you want to talk about APIs, my pet subject. So I am always happy to hear from you.